Welcome to Madlik. My name is Geoffrey Stern, and at Madlik we light a spark or shed some light on a Jewish text or tradition. We host Madlik Disruptive Torah on Clubhouse every Thursday night and share it as the Madlik podcast on your favorite platform. It is Shavuot, and tonight we will prove, with the help of Yehudah Halevi, and beyond the shadow of a doubt, that the Torah was given at Sinai. In the process, we hope to share an insight into the meaning and challenge of Sinai. So join us for The Echo of Sinai. Well, welcome to Madlik's Tikkun Leil Shavuot. It's so amazing to have you here, and I assume there's a lot of Torah going on in Clubhouse tonight. And when we're finished, I can't wait to swim in the ocean of Clubhouse Torah. But as I said in the intro, we are going to explore and use as a point of departure one particular great Jewish thinker. His name was Yehudah Halevi. Yehudah Halevi. He lived in the 12th century. He wrote the Kuzari anyway, between 1120 and 1140. And the Kuzari is a book of refutations and proof on behalf of a despised religion. So it was written in defense of Judaism at a time where we have the Inquisition and where both Islam and Christianity in their respective geographic areas were really adversaries of Judaism and the Jews. And it's a particular type of book. I said we're going to prove. There was a time where people actually tried to prove things. I think today there was a play on Broadway called Proof. When we talk about proof, maybe it's a mathematical proof. There isn't that much in our world, I believe, in the world of us moderns that we feel can be proved beyond a shadow of a doubt. So it was a little tongue-in-cheek, but I think Yehudah Halevi thought that he was proving something beyond any questionable doubt. And what I'd like to explore tonight is what we can learn from a proof besides being convinced or not convinced by its efficacy. The Kuzari has a plot. There is the king of the Khazars, and he has a dream, and the dream is that he needs to find the true religion. So he brings in a Christian. He calls him a scholastic, and he asks the scholastic, "What is the true religion?" At a certain point of time, the scholastic Kuzari in chapter 1:8 says, "I believe all that is written in the Torah and the records of the children of Israel, which are undisputed, because they are generally known as lasting and have been revealed before a vast multitude." So many of you have seen New Testaments. Many of their proof texts, they share that tradition with the Talmud, are proof texts from the prophets of Israel. They believe that it is truly a new covenant, a New Testament, but that means that they refer back to the people of Israel. And already at this point, Yehudah Halevi brings in a fascinating insight. It's not simply that the Christian is saying that Christianity is based on and maybe the fulfillment of what happened to the Jewish people and the Torah. He says, in a sense, it was proven because it was revealed before a vast multitude. Keep an eye on this argument because it's going to become really Yehudah Halevi's seminal argument. Then he brings in a doctor of Islam. And the doctor of Islam says, "We maintain that our book is the speech of God, being a miracle which we are bound to accept for its own sake, since no one is able to bring anything similar to it or one of its verses." And he goes on to say that it is a miracle when God speaks to a man like Muhammad. And the king of Khuzar says to him, it's such a miracle, how do you know that it happened? He says, it must have taken place in the presence of a great multitudes who saw it distinctly and did not learn it from reports and traditions. The Muslim says no. Similar to maybe what happened in Christianity, whether it was when Saul became Paul and had a revelation on the wayside, Muhammad had this amazing epiphany with God. It didn't happen amongst a multitude. So at a certain point, the king of Khazar, and of course Yehudah Halevi is controlling this whole narrative, says, indeed, I see myself compelled to ask the Jews because they are the relic of the children of Israel. Now, you have to understand the Khuzari was actually written in Arabic. In the source sheet, it's translated into Hebrew. And so you can't depend that much on the Hebrew translation, but when it says the relic of the children of Israel, the Hebrew is She'erit B'nai Yisrael. She'erit Yisrael, those of you who know the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue in New York, it's called She'erit Yisrael. These were people who were exiled from Spain in 1492. They were the remnants. And so here we get another theme that we find in the Khuzari, and that is not only is his book dedicated to the despised religion, but here he is. We are listening to the witness of the She'erit L'Israel, the remnants of this people, for I see that they constitute in themselves the evidence for the divine law on earth. So I guess the narrative that Yehudah Halevi creates is, since all of the Abrahamic religions are making reference to the children of Israel, why doesn't he go to the source? And then as the chronology continues, he talks about, again, we have in the early Bible, in Genesis, the chronology of Adam and Seth and Enosh. And then at a certain point of time, he says the chronology was established through the medium of those sainted persons who were only single individuals and not a crowd. But with Jacob began the 12 tribes, who were all under this divine influence. Thus, the divine element reached a multitude of persons who carried the records further. So now Yehudah Halevi is further developing that little seed of an idea that he mentioned before, which is what makes the Jewish revelation unique, is that it wasn't this epiphany between God and a single individual, but it was something done through a multitude. He starts with the 12 tribes, and then he goes on to, for the first time, explain, or he has the king of the Khazar explain what he's getting at. He says, an arrangement of this kind removes any suspicion of untruth or common plot. Not 10 people could discuss such a thing without disagreeing and disclosing their secret understanding, nor could they refute anyone who tried to establish the truth of a matter like this. How is it possible where such a mass of people is concerned? Finally, the period involved is not large enough to admit truth or untruth or fiction. So his argument, and believe it or not, you can even Google this, it's called the Khuzari principle, is a proof for the efficacy of a culture, of a religion, of a piece of miraculous history based on the fact that there was a multitude of people who saw the event, a multitude of people who experienced the event, and a multitude of people who then passed that event on to their children. And as he said before and develops further, people don't lie to their children. People have the check. It's almost a check and balance of I saw it, you saw it, we all saw it. You can't create a lie if there were other witnesses involved. And I think if we just stop there, I think you would all agree with me that it's like so many other proofs that we heard. It probably would convince the believer who already believed. It hardly sounds like something that's compelling. What it does do, I think, is we all are celebrating in our own way tonight the giving of the Torah at Sinai. And all of us have heard that there were 600,000 Jews at the foot of the mountain, maybe 600,000 men, another 600,000 women, all above the age of 20. So maybe we're talking about 1.5 million people. This is the traditional explanation. And it all sounds very nice, hardly a compelling argument. And I always left it at there. But then he starts to get a little bit more interesting, I believe. In 161, he says, "Didst thou ever see anyone who contrived a language, or didst thou hear of him?" So now he's starting to compare this argument about people do not transfer an untruth from generation to generation en masse unless there's some authenticity to it. And the first example that he gives is the example of language. We all pass down a language with all of its rules, with all of its syntax, with all of its grammatical structure. And we, of course, know what language can bear with it. It's not simply words. It becomes a way of thinking. It becomes cultural tics. These are things that are passed down, and we know that they're true. I don't know if true is the right word, but there's certainly something compelling and authentic about it. He goes on and he says, what about a week which begins with Sunday and ends with Shabbat? How is it possible that the people of China could agree with those of the Western Islands without common beginning, agreement, and convention? So now he's starting to bring other conventions. He might be mistaken in terms of anthropologically cultural studies. I'm sure there are some island culture that had an 8 or 9 day week or 10-day week, but we get his point. What he's saying is that there is authenticity and universal acceptance. And I would argue also that all of this, the cultural baggage that it carries to our calendar, to things that we would never question. They might be a convention, but they are almost baked into our very being, whether it's a language or whether it is a calendar. He goes even further in 165. What he said, East and West agree on the decimal system. What instinct induced them to keep to the number 10 unless it was a tradition handed down by the first one who did so? So now when he gets into math, I think we can't even stop to think maybe we're talking about if language and categories of the mind. We are now talking about intellectual mind and language contrived parameters that we seem to share even beyond one culture or another. And how, after all, are they translated? It starts to be something that becomes a little bit more profound. How, at this point in the conversation, does this quote-unquote proof, does it, forget about whether it's convincing, does it elicit in you an insight into how this man, at least, saw the religious truths or the traditions of his people? Is he making us look at these traditions differently? We live in a generation where millions of people have seen the same event, and they don't necessarily agree upon what they've seen. There are people who 9/11 is a prime example. So I think, to me, this multitude question or this proof from so many people, I think of a generation. We live in a generation where we have more people have access to the same information, and we have more differences of opinion. So I think from that perspective, his argument never really rang true to me. I would like to share another proof that I believe is one that is fascinating, not because it was compelling, but because of the different way it made people think. It is called the ontological proof for the existence of God, and it came from it's attributed, I should say, to a certain saint named Saint Anselm. And he lived in the 11th century also. And he said as follows. He says, let's agree on the definition of God. God is a being greater than which none can be conceived. So if you agree that God is a being greater of which you cannot conceive, since it is greater to exist in the mind and in reality, then it must be that God cannot only exist in the mind, he must also exist in reality. And therefore, God must exist. Now, there have been many people who have tried to figure out what is wrong with this argument because it's obviously wrong. And of course, the easiest way to get at it is to say the first premise is wrong. But I'd like to give you the history of this idea. There was another philosopher named René Descartes who took this idea in a whole different direction. He said to himself, I'm sitting in my room, and I'm looking at the table, and I'm looking at the door, and I'm looking at the light coming in from the window, and the only thing that I know for sure is that these things exist in my mind. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. What he did is he took that thought of Anselm, where Anselm said that since I have a notion in my mind of God, and God is a being greater of which does not exist, and since it is something better to exist than not, he must exist. But what he was really saying was that he exists for sure in my mind. And René Descartes' Cartesian philosophy is actually the basis of almost all modern philosophy. Epistemology is the philosophy of how do we know what we know. And after Descartes, it was never the same again. It was a question of how do I know what I know? What are the rules of science that I follow? Not that give me any veracity of the world. All I can say is what I see. The logical positivists, Wittgenstein and others, said all we can do is analyze language, because our mind can only think within the structure of language. The most radical was Immanuel Kant, and he came up with something called the categorical imperative. And he says, act only according to the maxim whereby you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. So getting back to math, which Yehudah Halevi mentioned a few moments ago, and the decimal system. Kant says you can only imagine a triangle with three sides. Now, that doesn't mean that a triangle can't exist with more than three sides, but we can only imagine it that way. And if you want to pick a rule of conduct, you can only pick a rule of conduct that is not only for you, but that would be a universal rule. And what he did here was something that I think becomes amazing, where he says that we are not describing the reality of our mind, we are now beginning to prescribe the reality of our mind. That if all we have is our mind, then we have to look into our mind. The word he used was a priori, meaning even without any experience, and see what our mind dictates. And so I think that if you go back to Yehudah Halevi now, and you start to see that his argument is in a sense based on what we have within our minds and our traditions, into our DNA, into our methods of thinking, these are the only truths that we have, the ones that we can extrapolate from. It doesn't make Anselm's proof any better, and it doesn't make Yehudah Halevi's proof any better. What it does do is it sensitizes us to a way of thinking. In Anselm, it was a single person. And for Yehudah Halevi, it was a group, a multitude of people. And for Anselm, it was to ask himself, through him and then Descartes and Kant, what are the universal structures of my mind? And Yehudah Halevi tried to do the same thing with his people, with his multitudes. And I think from that perspective, again, there are parts of this that we still cannot accept, but it becomes now a fascinating way to look back at that revelation, or that moment of revelation that we thought of. Before I get on to the last thinker that I want to talk about, who is someone called Emil Fackenheim, who really turned Yehudah Halevi on his head, I'd like to invite any of you who have any thoughts, questions, comments. Does this resonate with any of you in terms of how the concepts that came out of these simple mind games really can make us think about things in a radically new way? Go ahead, Lauren.
It's very, very calming to buy into this, or to believe this discussion. I do believe that, and I do believe that many people welcome that. I think our DNA, the Jewish DNA, is an evolved experiential DNA. We learn different stories and different morals and values as we develop the people, as history has evolved. So it's hard for me to accept this argument, but I understand that it's comforting and understandable for many. So that's just, I guess, my take on it.
I'm not coming at these arguments from a perspective of I want to be convinced or I expect to convince anybody else. What I think the arguments have revealed is that there are these structures within ourselves that whether we give it, for instance, let's add art, and you and I, Lauren, have actually discussed this once. Let's add music. These are constructs that are clearly something, and maybe there have been studies that animals can create music as well, and create art as well. But for the most part, these are constructs that we humans create. and we kind of know them when we see them, or we know something that's radically different than we see it. These are, I think, to say that they're figments of our imagination or that they're something that is only a construct is to miss the point. I think that they are the beginning of us to enable to enlarge our sphere of understanding. And I don't think it necessarily has to be something that is calming. I think it can be something that actually is extremely challenging, possibly even disturbing. So that's a wonderful segue into a thinker called Emil Fackenheim. And he wrote a book called God's Presence in History. And he actually turned Yehudah Halevi on his head. He did a paradigm shift. So whereas Yehudah Halevi said that history and the transmission of that history proves that there was Sinai, and it is descriptive in nature, Emil Fackenheim says, no. You got it wrong. It's not something that is descriptive. It's something that is prescriptive. It is an obligation. One of the famous things that Fackenheim said is, after the Holocaust, there is a 614th commandment. And the commandment in different variations is never to forget, never to give Hitler a posthumous victory. It is ultimately to survive. The survival then becomes a transmitter. Survival becomes a witness of history. We are not, and this is where I find Fackenheim so fascinating, is that it's not that the transmission makes revelation a fact or possible. It is the transmission itself that is the revelation. It is the obligation to transmit that is the obligation. And I'll just read something, a little bit of Fackenheim to give you a flavor of his thought. One of the biggest challenges he has is, how can you talk about theology? How can you talk about religion and God after the Holocaust? And he says, while religious thinkers were vainly struggling for a response to Auschwitz, Jews throughout the world, rich and poor, learned and ignorant, religious and non-religious, had to some degree been responding all along. For 12 long years, and this is during the Holocaust, Jews had been exposed to a murderous hate, which was as groundless as it was implacable. For 12 long years, the world had been lukewarm or indifferent, unconcerned over the prospect of a world without Jews. For 12 long years, the whole world had conspired to make Jews wish to cease to be Jews wherever, whenever, and in whatever way they could. Yet to this unprecedented invitation to group suicide, Jews responded with an unexpected will to live, with, under the circumstances, an incredible commitment to Jewish group survival. So what Fackenheim says is that those 600,000 Jews, those She'erit Yisrael, those remnants of a terrible, desperate situation, those who had every reason to not become witnesses, to not go on living, they, in their own almost organic way, decided to continue living. And that was the 614th commandment, but that was also the transmission of revelation. I think, Michael Posnick at the beginning talked about revelation is when man finds himself. And I think what Fackenheim is saying that, and of course for Fackenheim, it's the Holocaust that was the main moment where man had to either lose himself himself or find himself. But ultimately, there are many other small events throughout history. And I think Fackenheim's argument is that it is the transmission, the witnessing, and I would say not the description, but the prescription, the imperative of continuing to bear witness, to contribute to life, to grow, that ultimately is the ultimate proof is probably the wrong word, but it is the living dialectic of that moment where man discovered himself. He says, what accounts for this commitment to Jewish existence when there might have been, and by every rule of human logic should have been, a terrified and demoralized flight from Jewish existence? Why, since Auschwitz, has all previous distinction amongst Jews between religious and secularist, orthodox and liberal, diminished in importance to be replaced by a new, major distinction between Jews committed to Jewish survival, willing to be singled out and counted, and Jews in flight, who rationalize this flight as a rise to humanity in general? In my view, nothing less will do than to say that a commanding voice speaks from Auschwitz, and that these are Jews who hear it and Jews who stop their ears. So in a sense, what he is saying, and I would argue that we see this in the streets of Israel today, when these multitudes, maybe they're not 600,000, whatever position they're taking, they're deciding to speak out. I think that ultimately is what Yehudah Halevi is saying that happened at Sinai, is that this group of people were touched by something that made them continue to be touched by it, who touched by something that gave them an imperative to continue to be touched by that and to convey that, and to, at the end of the day, ultimately believe in the potential of man. And that, I think, is ultimately what revelation comes out from these discussions, that we all are She'erit Yisrael, we are all the remainders, the spark, the emanation of that moment. But what becomes more important is not the moment, but the process. And that's, I looked at Yehudah Halevi's argument from a totally different perspective than I ever looked at it before. And I looked at it from the uniqueness of what we are celebrating tonight, that happened under some distant mountain by people so long ago, that we are still celebrating tonight. So that's the thought that I wanted to share with you all, and I'd love to hear your comments and questions and impressions.
Would you agree that human survival is something that is innate in quality in all human beings? In other words, how one looks at an event in history, such as the Holocaust, it is our survival that gets us, that propels us forward. And one of the wonderful things, in my opinion, about our Jewish history is that it gives us a filter to identify and to expand that issue of survival. It's how we see life based upon a long history of similar type of events. So I guess I still have a problem of being that if in fact we believe it to be true, it's true, is where we stop. I think we continue along a line of learning from where we've come from. I don't know how you respond to that.
Talking about a particular message of a particular people, and there's the old question of whether the universal is in the particular, or we're just talking about the people of Israel. I think the fascinating thing of the way Yehudah Halevi set up the kuzari is that he sets up clearly the only world that he knew was the world of the Abrahamic religions, although he does mention China in it. What he's trying to say is that there is a universal message, I think, from this particular story, which is our story. I'm sure there are other people, other cultures have similar lessons to be learned from other traditions. But I think what here we are celebrating the giving of the Torah at Sinai, and this man, and I would argue that Fackenheim comes out of him, and that maybe to another degree there are threads of shared threads between him and some of the other more well-known philosophers that I mentioned. The idea is that there are moments, whether it's the Holocaust, whether it's a revelation at a Sinai, whatever it is, that has an impact upon us. But the most important thing is not that moment, but how we transfer that, translate it, transmit it. And I think that's just a wonderful lesson for a holiday that is, at the end of the day, just celebrating nothing more and nothing less than a moment of illumination, a moment where something happened as radical, as crazy as a God speaking, but at the end of the day, it's less about God speaking and it's more about the impression of whatever happened there on this multitude of people and the direction they took it in. And that kind of is fascinating to me. And it does impact how we think about other very human ideas, such as art, such as math, such as music. These are things that we do transmit and that do become almost categories of our mind and also categories of our culture. And these are valuable things. And it's probably valuable once in a while to speak about them because they are different than other data points that we have and other mechanical things and tactile things that we can transfer and transmit. These are just ideas and radical structures that we somehow are able to transmit from one to the other and celebrate. I don't know if that addresses what you were saying.
No, I think that was a wonderful summary. I do agree exactly with what you say. So I would agree with your premise. I'm not sure I would take the initial one that because of the fact that the multitudes say that this exists, that it exists. I'm not sure that's where I would go, but I think your message synthesizes it in a manner that I can accept it. So I really want to thank you for that, and Hag Sameach.
Thank you. And I would just circle back to the first statement and about 600,000 people wouldn't lie about something that happened. I would say that from the perspective of what we've been discussing, that if 6,000 people were affected by something, then 600,000 people were affected by something, and that is a truth. Whether anything else happened outside of them is another question. So it really becomes fascinating. It's the social fact, not the historical fact. And Yehudah Halevi would probably disagree with me, but I think that's what my point was. It's a variation on I think, therefore I am. If I think it, and all I can say is that I think it. I think that if a multitude of people, either 2,000, 3,000 years ago, or a multitude of people today share a beautiful belief or a terrible belief, all that one can say is that they share a beautiful belief or they share a terrible belief. But that in itself has, I think, has the potential for an amazing discussion and illumination. So that was my point. And I think we're on the same page with regard to that. It doesn't say anything about what actually happened or didn't happen. Michael, I'd love to hear your thoughts if you're...
I think what you've done is keep revelation from being a one-time, a single moment event. However, it started like a big bang. It continues, as you say, to be transmitted, and that is its life. So revelation is a continuing experience, like what we're having right now. We're trying to reveal something, and to the extent that we pick up what was given to us and pass it on, that's about as divine as it can be. However it's moved, I mean, I prefer to say I am, and then I think. I put God first in that way, just being, existence first. And then because of that, because of being given all that we've been given, I'm able to do something we call thinking. So that's another piece, another thought that I had. Another thought that I had, Geoffrey, is that to make a proof for something is an intellectual event. It's an intellectual effort. And maybe the mind will be satisfied with its own proofs. But what's beyond mind is not to be described or proved, is to be experienced. And that brings me back to the first statement, that the experience of what's divine or holy or godlike is ongoing, and it has a continuing, vibrant, sometimes disturbing, as you point out, life. But it's for us to grapple it and love it and be loved by it. So I think those are the thoughts that I have, Geoffrey. They're kind of jumbled, but that's what's there. I just don't feel the need to prove intellectually or with the mind that God exists. Again, I say first there's something divine, some great power that's there, some indescribable and intimate and mysterious at the same time force that allows us to have these conversations and to think and do everything we do. I don't think it's the other way around. And that's the end of the words. And I like the fact that all this revelation that you talk about was given b'kol dumamak daka, in a still, small voice, not trying to prove anything. Chag Sameach, Geoffrey. Thank you.
Chag Sameach. I love, I am there, and then I think, because what you're saying and what you also said when you talked about proof is that there's something beyond, or something that transcends thought, and transcends my thought, and I think that since I'm going to give this talk tomorrow night, what I'm struggling with is how to convey that I'm actually not interested in the proofs. I'm interested in the unintended consequences of the proof. And I think that's what Yehudah Halevi and Anselm both had in common. They set out to prove something, but where I believe Descartes and Kant and Wittgenstein and all the rest took it, had nothing to do with proving God, but it had to do with that kernel that Anselm stumbled upon, which was actually the weakness of his proof. That at the end of the day, you say, Anselm, the only thing that you've proven is that you believe in God, or that there is a God who's defined as a being of which there is nothing greater resides in your mind. And that's probably the biggest fallacy with his proof. Mm-hmm. But what came from that is that, okay, well, what about some other things that are in a mind that only exist in the mind, that exist a priori to experience, like a triangle, like a universal moral dictate. And that's what I found so fascinating. And then I went back to Yehudah Halevi, and I go, okay, he hasn't convinced anybody of anything. 600,000 people can convey the worst truth that you'd ever want to have. But what he did reveal in a similar way to St. Anselm is that there are social truths that we convey, and that those truths can also be not only descriptive, but they can be prescriptive, that can become a life's work to, as you say, to transmit, and where the transmission becomes more important than the content of the transmission. Where so that's where, and I'm struggling, because I think the second you say the word proof, people go, "Oh my God, we're talking. Are we really doing this? Are we really having angels dancing in the top of a needle? Are we going back to clericism? But I do think that there's when great minds struggled with certain things. It's kind of like when you are trying to create a drug for one objective, and you find out, no, actually that cures Alzheimer's, or that cures something else. There's an unintended consequence of the exploration. And I think that's what I find so fascinating about these two thinkers, not their proof, or not what they were intending to prove, but the insight that they give us.
Yeah, that's really good, Jeff.
Yeah.
That's really good. And besides which, so you have a proof. That's all you got.
A proof never proved anything to anybody.
It doesn't give anything. It doesn't give you anything. It's like an old pancake.
Yeah.
You have a proof, Mazel Tov. Now what? What's your life really like? What does this proof do for you, in the way you treat other people, and the way you treat yourself, and the way you treat the divine that's all around us all the time?
Yeah. But again, that's my challenge, to take these proofs and to use them as a way to give us those unintended consequences, because clearly these were great minds trying to prove one thing, but we have
Yes.
the liberty to take it in a totally different direction, and maybe at the end of the day, that's what revelation is all about. Maybe God was trying to say one thing, and we're entitled to hear it differently. That's the Shivim Panim LeTorah, the 70 faces to the Torah. That's the Elu ve'elu, Divrei Elohim Chayim. That this and this, both. There is no truth. There is no truth. I think somewhere it refers to the revelation at Sinai almost as a hammer hitting an anvil when the sparks are flying. One of the coolest things I ever heard that only a modern could appreciate is if you did a Google search and you came up with one answer, you would you'd hit the side of your computer. You think that the internet was dead. We live in a world where when we search, we want to find that multiplicity, that Shivim Panim LeTorah. And those like Yehudah Halevi, who were trying to find the proof that there is only one message, I think they've missed the boat. But again, I am indebted to these great minds who gave us the unintended consequences of their thinking.
Geoffrey, Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach, everybody. Ruthie, Matthew, Melissa, Chava, Lauren, pleasure studying Torah with you. All the best.